What's up, Falcons Nation? It's your boy Jew coming at you with another Atlanta Falcons video. As always, Falcons Nation, rise up. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about the Atlanta Falcons secondary. I also want to talk about a statement that Dan Quinn recently made about our Atlanta Falcons, and also want to talk a little bit about the upcoming NFL draft. But with that being said, if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you'll know when I've done Atlanta Falcons content. Also hit that like button for your boy. Let's continue to grow this thing. But I appreciate each and every one of you guys. And as always, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. So yesterday, I believe it was, I seen a statement that Dan Quinn stated that Kendall Sheffield, he believes could be a #1 corner in the NFL and a #1 corner for our Atlanta Falcons. I do agree with this statement that Dan Quinn made. I do believe it's a bold statement by Dan Quinn, but I do agree with Dan Quinn. I've said it recently in a lot of my videos or my former videos that I do believe that Kendall Sheffield has the highest ceiling for our defensive backs. I do believe he's the best defensive back on our team. I do believe he's better than an Isaiah Oliver. He has more to offer. He does have 4.3 speed. He's physical at the point of attack. He's a good tackler. And he just does everything above average. He does everything well. With Isaiah Oliver, the only advantage I think Isaiah Oliver has over Kendall Sheffield is he's a little bit longer. His arms are a little bit longer, so he's able to bat balls away. And he does a good job of pinning wide receivers to the sideline and using his length to try to bat the ball away. So I do think that Isaiah Oliver does have qualities, and he improved over the last part of the season last year as well as Kendall Sheffield. But I think that Kendall Sheffield currently is the best defensive back on the team, and I think he has a higher ceiling than Isaiah Oliver, because I noticed with Isaiah Oliver, he's not the fastest player. He doesn't have that great speed. So if he gets beat off the line, or if he gets burned, he doesn't have that catch-up speed to get back. Get back and catch up to a receiver and bat the ball away. If he gets beat on a double move, he just gets beat, and pretty much he's toast at that point. Whereas Kendall Sheffield is a great athlete. I believe he ran track at Ohio State as well. So he's one of those players that kind of like a Robert Alford, who we used to have on our team, that has supreme speed and is a supreme athlete, and he can use that ability to his advantage over Isaiah Oliver, who's not the greatest athlete. But with that being said, as you know, if you've been watching in the media, I've been seeing a ton of media experts and stuff like that on ESPN, on Twitter, talking about the Atlanta Falcons possibly moving up and trading up in this draft to draft Jeff Okudah, the defensive back out of Ohio State, or taking the defensive back CJ Henderson out of the University of Florida. Personally, if you've been watching my channel, I don't necessarily want the Atlanta Falcons to move up or even to draft a cornerback with the 16th pick or in the first round at all. Personally, I do think that we need to continue to build in the trenches. I do think that if we're going to move up, we should be moving up for a Javon Kinlaw or a Derek Brown, or even a Chase Young, one of those guys. Personally, I do think that the defensive tackle should be the #1 priority if we're moving up. I wouldn't move up for a corner because, as I mentioned in my other videos, I do think that this is a deep draft for cornerback. And even if we stayed at 16, if they wanted to take a cornerback, it would be a quality corner still left on the board at 16. It's no use of moving up to number 5 or moving up in the top 10 just to select CJ Henderson, who still may be there at 16, or it'll be other guys like a Jeff Gladney from TCU still there. It'll be a Trayvon Diggs out of Alabama still there. A number of cornerbacks, Cameron Dantzler out of Mississippi State. It's a ton of good corners in this draft. So I definitely wouldn't move up in this draft to take a defensive back. As I mentioned before, I believe in building a great front seven. I do think that you need some quality secondary players, but I don't believe in having a great secondary and having a poor front seven or having a poor defensive line. I believe that you definitely start with, when you're building a defense, you definitely start up front with the big boys, because football is a game of inches. And no matter how great your secondary is, if you can't stop the run, I don't care how great, who you have in the back end. If you can't stop the run, you're not going to be a successful defense. The number one priority for any defense should always be first stop the run and rush the passer, and then worry about covering, the passes, covering wide receivers and things of that nature. So I think our priorities wouldn't be in order if we try to build an elite secondary and, and just have an average or below average defensive line. I definitely think that the biggest issue with the Atlanta Falcons defense last year wasn't the secondary necessarily. I believe the biggest issue was no pass rush and not being able to stop the run consistently. Teams being able to gash us right up the gut because Grady Jarrett is the only defensive prowess or presence we have in the middle. The guys like Tyler Davison and Allen Bailey and those guys are just rotational guys. They're not lockdown defenders. They're not guys that are going to change the game or penetrate like Fletcher Cox, like a Grady Jarrett. They're not players that's going to get tackles for loss and stuff like that. They're just guys that'll try to hold the point. But to be honest, last year, we were basically getting bullied in the trenches. We were getting knocked back. If you remember the game when we played against the Indianapolis Colts, when we needed to get the ball back to try to make the comeback, Marlon Mack was able to run right up the gut on numerous occasions and pick up 5 and 6 yards a clip. And it was really, really embarrassing. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about a team not being able to stop the run was the last NFC game I watched last year, which was the Green Bay Packers versus the San Francisco 49ers in the NFC Championship game, when basically the 49ers gutted the Green Bay Packers. And I was super embarrassed for the Green Bay Packers defense not being able to stop the run. It almost looked like a Little League game where they knew that Mostert was going to get the ball, but they really couldn't stop it. It was just like they were running the ball up the middle, and it was just like a hot knife through butter, where Mostert ran all over those guys for 200-plus yards, and it looked almost like a high school or peewee football game. The way that the Green Bay Packers, their defense looked so porous in the way that they couldn't stop the run, and their front seven looked really, really bad. And that was the first time I've ever seen in a professional football game a team only throw the ball like 7 or 8 times the whole game. I know it for sure in a championship game. That was the first time I've ever seen a team basically get bullied in the trenches and one team just consistently run the ball like they were playing a game of Madden and the other team couldn't stop them. So we definitely don't want to be the Green Bay Packers of last year. If you remember last year, the Packers went out and got Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith on the edges, and those guys played really well up until that NFC Championship game where they got ran off the field and it was very embarrassing to watch those guys basically look helpless and get ran through and get knocked off the football all night long. So if the Falcons want to win the Super Bowl, the way that you do that is you build your trenches first. You don't worry about the guys out on the edge so much. You do need to bring in cornerbacks. I'm not saying the Falcons shouldn't draft a corner, but you don't start, when you're building a defense, you never start with a great cornerback. You always start with either an edge rusher or a defensive tackle. The better defenses in the league, or teams that are known for defense, like the New York Giants, like the Chicago Bears, they always have an elite edge player. They always have an elite defensive tackle. Even the Philadelphia Eagles, they always have physical guys up front. They always have great edge players, and they always have beef in the trenches. And the Falcons must learn and get back to bringing the beef in the middle. We have to have beef up front. When we did go to the Super Bowl in 2016, we had the beef up front with Jonathan Babineau, Grady Jarrett, Rashid Hageman, who was like 6'7" or 6'6", 300-plus pounds. We had guys we could rotate in, like Courtney Upshaw, and guys that were overlooked. But we had guys that were physical up front and physical at the point of attack. And they prevented our team from being gashed in the running game. Another thing that I see that's a misconception by a lot of YouTubers and a lot of just basic fans, football fans in general. I hear a lot about the Seattle Seahawks and how great the Legion of Boom was. But what we got to remember with the Legion of Boom is, yes, they were one of the greatest secondaries of all time, but they were one of the great defenses of all time, not just a great secondary. If you remember, their front seven was great as well. Bobby Wagner is possibly a future Hall of Famer at the middle linebacker position. KJ Wright at the linebacker is a very solid linebacker. He does his job very well in being that force of stopping the run. On that defensive line, they had a great defensive line. They had Michael Bennett in his prime. They had Cliff Averill in his prime, who were getting double-digit sacks. They had Bruce Irvin in his prime. Brandon Mebane. They had a bunch of guys up front that were physical at the point of attack, and they had guys that could attack the quarterback. So it wasn't just about the Legion of Boom. It was about that defense being a great historical defense all the way around. So when you mention the Seattle Seahawks defense, they need to be mentioned with the 85 Bears. They need to be mentioned with the 2000 Ravens. They need to be mentioned with the I think it's the 99 Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Warren Sapp and Derek Brooks and Booger McFarland. They need to be mentioned with those great defenses of all time, because they didn't only have great secondary, but they had a great defense all around. And I feel like that's something that's being overlooked when we talk about our Falcons. I think it's a misconception to think that if we build a great secondary, that our front seven could be average or below average. Personally, I think that we need a great front seven, a very good front seven. We already have decent linebackers. I think that Deion Jones is a great linebacker. Foye Oluokun, he still has time to prove himself, but I think he could be a solid linebacker in this league. I think that Dante Fowler could be considered a great edge rusher, or could become a great edge rusher. Grady Jarrett is definitely a top 5 defensive tackle in the league, but I believe that Grady Jarrett needs someone beside him that you can drop right next to him. And also, you need another edge rusher, because I don't necessarily believe that Pat McKinley is that guy that's going to possibly get us to the promised land. I think that you're going to need somebody else that you can rotate in there that can also bring pressure. If you remember the New York Giants, the year that they upset the New England Patriots, when they won the Super Bowl, they had Michael Strahan on that defensive line. They had Osi Umenyiora on that defensive line. They had Justin Tuck. They had a number of guys that they brought in that they could rotate in, and that sometimes they would run all 4 of those guys. Like on third down situations, they would have all of those guys in the game together, which they called their NASCAR lineup, where they would bring pressure from everywhere. So I think that our Falcons, we must try to adopt that same aggressive play style, and we must continue to build these trenches. We can't take it lightly. We can't think that we can reverse engineer our way to a Super Bowl, meaning, well, if we build a great back end, that'll take care of the front end. Personally, I think it's harder to build a great secondary than it is to build a great front seven. And the reason I say that is the way that the rules are lined up in today's NFL, it benefits the passing game and it benefits receivers. So you hardly ever see any lockdown corners anymore. It's hard to find. Even if we take Jeff Okudah, he could be a top 5 corner, but it's rare that you see any cornerback nowadays locking up any top wide receiver. Prime example is Patrick Peterson for the Cardinals. Everybody knows that Patrick Peterson was a top 5 corner, probably still is a top 5 corner, definitely a top 10 corner in the league. But every time he goes up against Julio Jones or the better corners or the better wide receivers in the game, he gets exposed. And the reason he gets exposed is the rules are so bent towards the offense, or favors the offense so much that you can't touch anybody past 5 yards off the line of scrimmage, that it's hard for anybody, even if Deion Sanders were to play in today's game. I really think that he would have a difficult time, or a more rougher time trying to cover receivers nowadays than when he covered them back in the 90s, because the rules were different. Back in the day, it was no such thing as a receiver being, I think what they call it, like when you got to let the receiver catch the ball. It was no such thing back then. If you came across the middle, they were able to lay you out. Or a defenseless receiver is what I was thinking of. Back in the day in the 90s, it was no such thing as a defenseless receiver. So Ronnie Lott could lay guys out if they came across the middle. As soon as their fingertips touched the ball, or any portion of that ball was touched by anybody, Ronnie Lott could basically rip your head off. But nowadays, if you're coming across the middle, the defensive back or the safety pretty much has to let the receiver get a chance at catching the ball. And it's hard nowadays to jar the ball loose and hit a wide receiver to the point to make them drop the football, because now all of the targeting rules, you really can't lay receivers out like you could back in the 90s and back in the day where the rules were more even and more fair. So I feel like the best way to build a great defense nowadays is to build a great front seven where you're bringing pressure, because it's not as many rules on sacking a quarterback or hitting a quarterback than it is against defenseless receiver, holding against a receiver, or pass interference against a receiver. Now the main rules now with sacking a quarterback is just not coming down with all your weight on them and not hitting them below the knees. That's pretty much the two rules that has recently changed in the 2000s or the 2010s, since the last decade, since Tom Brady had that season-ending injury. That's been the main rule changes when it comes to like hitting a quarterback. So I feel like it's much easier to build an elite front seven than it is to build an elite back end. And you can just look at the last couple of Super Bowl champions. I mentioned before the Kansas City Chiefs, who recently won the Super Bowl. They don't have an elite secondary. Their best or number one corner is Bashaud Breeland, who played with the Washington Redskins. He was drafted by the Washington Redskins, and he now plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then they have, I believe, Kendall Fuller, or one of the Fuller brothers. I know it's two different brothers. One plays for Chicago and one plays for Kansas City. I always get them mixed up. It's either Kendall Fuller or I forget the other one's name, but I know that they don't have elite corners over there with the Kansas City Chiefs. But what they do have with Kansas City is they have an elite front seven with the defensive line. Their trenches were great last year with Terrell Suggs, Chris Jones, the big defensive tackle, the all-pro defensive tackle, Frank Clark, the former Seattle Seahawks defensive end and edge rusher. So they had a ton of guys up front that were able to get pressure, and they had big boys up front. They had that beef up front. And when it was time to make a play in the Super Bowl, Chris Jones batted down that pass on third down, which gave Patrick Mahomes and those guys the football back. And they also played a huge role in stopping the Tennessee Titans in the AFC Championship game. When Chris Jones came back in that game, because I believe he was injured in the first playoff game that they played against the Texans, but he came back in that AFC Championship game when they faced Derrick Henry, who had recently run all over the Ravens and run all over the Patriots. When they came to Arrowhead to face the Chiefs, that defense and Chris Jones in that front seven basically shut Derrick Henry down. He wasn't able to get going, and they were able to stifle the Tennessee Titans offense. So I feel like the Falcons, as our Atlanta Falcons, we must take a page out of the book of the Kansas City Chiefs. Also, recently, the Philadelphia Eagles, when they faced the Patriots in the Super Bowl, they didn't have an elite secondary. You probably can't even name two cornerbacks that play for the Philadelphia Eagles because they don't have a great secondary. They have Malcolm Jenkins at safety, Jalen Mills, but they don't have any great guys. Ronald Darby, they don't have great corners over there. But they do have a great front seven. They have a ton of guys that they rotate in on that defensive line. And one thing that you're not going to do when you play a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, you're not going to bully those guys in the trenches. You're not going to bully Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, and all of those big boys that they have up front. You're not going to bully those guys. Timmy Jernigan, you're not going to bully those guys. You're not going to knock those guys off the football. And the only way that you're going to beat them is possibly by trying to torch them through the air. And it's even harder. It's even hard to do that sometimes because they have so many guys, so many great pass rushers that the quarterback doesn't have the time to sit back there and dissect their weakness, which is their secondary. So with that being said, I think that was enough ranting about the front seven or us building a great defensive line. But I definitely think that personally, I think our Falcons have a better chance at building a great defensive line than trying to build a great secondary. I do believe that we still should take a cornerback in this draft, but I think it should be with the second or third round pick, maybe a Cameron Dantzler out of Mississippi State at cornerback, maybe a Jeff Gladney later on in the draft, maybe a Bryce Hall out of the University of Virginia, who still should be on the board at that time. But all of the great cornerbacks, or the better quarterbacks that's been rated, the better cornerbacks that's been rated by NFL.com and all of these analysts, Todd McShay and these guys, the Jeff Okudas and the C.J. Hendersons of the world. I think those cornerbacks are great. Don't get me wrong. I think those guys are great, but I don't think you necessarily need those guys to win a Super Bowl. I think you do need a Javon Kinlaw. We do need Derek Brown, because we need somebody that you can place beside Grady Jarrett. And I'm telling you guys right now, I don't have anything against Allen Bailey and Tyler Davison and those guys, but I just don't think that those guys are game changers. Those guys are just a rotating type of rotational type of pieces. Those guys are not pieces that scare anybody, and they're not players that basically are going to lock anybody up. We definitely need to go out and get one of these big, imposing defensive tackles that's going to be able to shut down the run and force teams to be more one-dimensional by putting the ball in the air. Now, with that being said, if we do decide to move up in this draft and take Isaiah Simmons, or take C.J. Henderson, or take a Jeff Okudah, if those are the top guys on Thomas Dimitroff's draft board, if those guys are at the top of his draft board, I feel like go ahead and take them. But you got to remember, you have to. I definitely think you have to talk to the coaches and find out what type of scheme are we going to run and how they're going to use these guys, because everything reverts back to coaching at the end of the day. If we do decide to take a Isaiah Simmons, or we do decide to take a C.J. Henderson or Jeff Okudah, we have to use these guys, play to these guys' strength. We can't play to these guys' weakness. We can't just say, well, we're a cover 3 team and get with it. We have to use these guys to the best of their ability. So that means allowing Jeff Okudah to travel with the best receivers on a team. If we decide to bring him in every game, allow him to travel and not just play on one side of the field, we must allow him to do that if that's the strength of his game. I feel like some of the problems last year also was coaches weren't using players or playing to players' strength, and we must learn how to play to these guys' strength. Devondre Campbell, later in the season, he played better the second half of the season when Raheem Morris and them allow him to play closer to the line and be more of a blitzer and be more of a imposing figure in the run game. So we have to play to these guys' strength. That's a must, no matter who you draft. So if we decide to go with Jeff Okudah, or we decide to go with Isaiah Simmons or Chase Young, whoever we decide to trade up for, I'll be all down for it. But we have to come in and play these guys, play to these guys' strength. Because as I was saying before, one thing that Bill Belichick does better than anybody else, he doesn't always have the best athletes. He doesn't always have the 5-star recruits or the best players, but he plays to the player's strength. He uses players to the best of their ability. And that's what we must do when we go and draft these players this year in the NFL draft. We must select players, and we must know what these players' roles are. I do feel like in the last couple seasons, we've done a bad job at picking up all of these players that are kind of like projects, like John Kaminsky and like Deidre Sanat, where we don't know. They don't know what role they have carved out for these guys, and that could be a bad thing. If you don't know how you're going to deploy the weapons that you have, that could be a serious problem for our team. And I feel like we have a ton of guys that were wasted last year that just sat on the bench. They didn't even dress in games like a Deidre Sanat. So, we don't even know what this kid is capable of. So I definitely think another thing is, if you're going to draft these players, we need to go ahead and play them on game day to find out what they can do. Because sometimes in practice, because all of these, padded practices has been decreased over the years because of the CBA and stuff like that, sometimes you're going to have to throw these guys into, live action, into live fire, and see what these guys' strengths and weaknesses are. Because we've had Deidre Sanat on our roster, I think, for 3 years now, and I still don't know what he's capable of, or even if he's a quality player or not. So I think it's time to carve out bigger roles for some of these guys, give some of these guys playing time, whether it's in the preseason and whether it's in live action during these games. Let these guys dress out and rotate these guys into the game and see what they can do. I mean, we weren't afraid to throw Isaiah Oliver into the fire, so let's throw some of these other guys into the fire and see what they can do. But with that being said, this being your boy Jew, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Definitely let me know if it's any player that you want me to go in and review before the draft. Definitely let me know, and I'll definitely go check it out on YouTube, or go check out some highlights of these players. I appreciate all of you guys for continuing to tune in. Also, let me know in the comment section what player you would like the Atlanta Falcons to draft at 16. Personally, you guys know I've been on the train of K'Lavon Chaisson. If we stay at 16, if we decide to trade up in this draft, I want either Javon Kinlaw or I want Derrick Brown. Those are the two guys that I want if we're trading up. No disrespect to a Jeff Okudah. I love the kid's game. And no disrespect to C.J. Henderson, because I think both of those guys, are great cornerbacks, and they could have the capability of being all-pro players in the NFL. But if we're going to go after those players, like I said, we must play to these guys' strengths. But with that being said, this has been your boy Jew signing off. I'll holler at you guys in the next video. And as always, Falcons Nation, rise up. Peace. I'll holler at you guys.